So good evening and hello and welcome to all our listeners and followers. This is the Square One podcast. Today, your host is myself, Steve Ramsden. I'm the contract sales director here in London. As you all know, we're an IT recruitment agency based in the city with customers all over the world, placing into weird and wonderful technologies, but also interesting and new emerging markets. One of them is an area of great interest to a lot of you, would probably be a good place to start, is the blockchain market or blockchain sector. And today I have a very, very interesting host with me, a guest speaker with me this evening, Mr. Steve Ross-Talbot. Steve is an expert in his field. He has years of experience in the IT sector. But not only that, he is an avid follower of blockchain and anything crypto. And I'm bringing him into the show today to talk about some very interesting topics. Steve, great to have you on the show today. It'd be great if you could give us a bit of an introduction into yourself and obviously the reasons why you're here for this evening's chat.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. So potted history. I'm no spring chicken. I've been doing this for a long time. I first cut my first piece of code that I cut would have probably been 1974. And I was then registered to do O-level computer studies at Dover Boys Grammar School. So wow. There weren't many schools, to be fair, that did this. And in those days, just to give people an understanding of what it was like, in those days, you would encode your program on paper tape or on punch cards. So that means you'd write the code out by hand.
Wow.
On a piece of paper, and then you would type it up, and then it would go off. Now, in the case of the punch cards, it went to Imperial, and I lived in Dover. So it was a 3-day turnaround to find out that you forgot to put a semicolon in a particular place. And if you were lucky and it was on paper tape, it went to Kent. It was a 2-day turnaround, paper tape. And when I got to, so I went to Leeds University in 1978. I think I went up to Leeds University to do computational science, as it was called then. And what was really quite startling for me, having been used to writing my code on pieces of paper, and then translating them into whatever form to get them compiled and eventually running, is that suddenly they had terminals and you could type your program in directly. There was none of this WYSIWYG stuff. I mean, it was just a terminal. It was like using ed. In fact, that was the editor, ed, on Unix, because VI didn't really exist then. Yeah. So, and I just want to give that as a context, because today, what I often see around me, and I'm a professor of distributed computing as well. I got appointed as a professor in 2012. And the citation read something like, for your contribution to the pool of human knowledge. I'm not quite sure what pool and what knowledge I contributed, really. But perhaps an awful lot of experience at the end of the day. One of the things I found quite fascinating is how easy it is for developers to think they've got it right. And then it turns out they haven't. There was something that they misunderstood. 9 times out of 10, it is not because it was just a straight coding bug. The difficult ones aren't usually that. It's usually because they didn't understand the requirement. And it's usually because the requirement wasn't described unambiguously to them. So it's really quite difficult to code when you don't quite know what you're coding. So requirements end up being quite important. And so, onto blockchain, it's an example of distributed computing. Nothing new there. What is it? On the one side, I've heard people say, yeah, but it's just an immutable linked list. And so what? What's interesting about that? We've been doing linked lists for ages, and we can do read-only databases. And that's really true, right? It's actually a very important point. There's a guy called John Davies, who's quite well known in the industry. He runs, I think, VeloPay. He's the CTO and the founder of VeloPay. I've known him for many years. And he often says this. He often says, "Oh, that's just a linked list. There's nothing interesting about blockchain fundamentally." That's not actually true. It is just a linked list. There is truth behind that, but the way in which a linked list may scale to internet scale is very different. So in this next generation of blockchains, you'll see a lot more emphasis on sharding. So RChain, the RChain Co-op does this, Radix DLT do this sharding. There's a few of them out there doing this sharding. You can't really shard if you're using proof of work for a number of reasons. But if you're using proof of stake, then it kind of lends itself to sharding. And so you get better scale.
Well, for some of our listeners who may not know what sharding is, would you mind just giving a bit of a quick minute or so?
Yeah, sure.
A to Z of blockchain for dummies like me.
It's kind of weird because I grew up in the database age. I wrote my first SQL compiler in 1981. Right, I was one of the early SQL compiler guys. So I've done databases forever, and sharding. When I first came across the term, a bit like you, I said, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So I scratched beneath the surface to find out what it means. And if you look at some of the literature around 1986-ish, when distributed distributed relational databases were all in vogue. Ingress being one of the best known, that then gave rise to Postgres. Sharding was a way of separating the database into either columns that live on particular nodes or subsets of columns and rows that live on particular nodes based on some discriminant. So typically you might have all of New York's data generally residing in New York. That would be sensible. And all of London's data residing in London. But somehow, logically, you're able to run a query across all of it and it all comes back. And sharding's no different. So it's a way of slicing the data so that the data is nearer to the consumer, shall we say, or the consumers. And there's all sorts of different ways to do it. I sometimes think in our profession we come up with new terms like sharding, just to confuse people. Exactly. So that's kind of what sharding is. It's important because it enables the reality in transactional processing and distributed computing. The reality is that we never need completely accurate consistency. We need eventual consistency. So I'll give you an example. If we're looking at our bank account, we want we want it to reflect what the bank account is, right? So how much money is in there. But if we were looking at it over time, we don't care whether it's off by £1 here or £1 there over a 3-month period. If we're doing management information reports and we're looking at our cash flow forecasting, again, we don't care whether it's right to the penny. But when you do the accounts for the official audit, you do. So there is this notion of transactional consistency and this notion of what we call eventual consistency. The world runs on eventual consistency. How many times have you gone to the web? And I ordered something recently. I went on the web. I needed some flow gas. People should try this at home. Try and find flow gas in the UK. There is a national shortage. But I went to Homebase because they said on their screen that they had some in stock. Well, this is where eventual consistency gets you out. So I went to Homebase in my car and found that there was no flow gas. So eventual consistency didn't work in my favor in that case.
It really didn't.
So that's the example. But at least it meant that I didn't actually buy one because I couldn't, because there wasn't one there. And I could have bought it online, of course, and then found that there wasn't anything. And those things are really important. Understanding the nature of how we interact with computers ends up becoming quite fundamental to the blockchain story. So the idea that you can have two people transacting and their transactions can be recorded on the blockchain in different places on the blockchain concurrently. Well, of course, everyone would say, of course you should be able to do that. They shouldn't have to queue up. So, if I trade with you, Steve, and if two other people are trading, sending each other Bitcoin or whatever, well, of course, they should be able to do it concurrently, right? However, if I send you something and then as a result of that, you send something to somebody else because of that you want serialized, right? So sharding and this notion of proof of stake, which is much faster. When you shard and you have proof of stake, what all that's about in blockchain is about trying to make blockchains go at tens of thousands of transactions per second. Because I don't know how many people realize this, Bitcoin's blockchain does about 10 transactions per second globally. That's all. Right.
Wow.
Now, if you work in the City of London, right, in financial services, you don't get out of bed for 10 transactions a second.
No.
You stay asleep. When it's 100 to 1,000, maybe you start getting interested, right? Visa habitually does 40 to 60,000 TPS globally, right? And at a burst, when things go crazy around Christmas, it's doing about 80,000 TPS. It turns out that doing lots of transactions per second to put data on some storage, be it a blockchain or otherwise, doing that at scale is just not so easy, right? So with Bitcoin's blockchain, 10 transactions a second doesn't sort of make you think, well, if I wrote a game on a blockchain today, so if I took Ethereum as the more modern blockchain instead of Bitcoin's blockchain, which is just for Bitcoin. If I took Ethereum to write a game, going to write a game, develop some smart contracts. It's a game that will have some kind of token, so crypto, that you put in the slot so that the game works. Right? So you're paying for usage. It's much more transparent in that way, blockchain. When we're using Facebook, we're not aware that the reason why we're allowed to use Facebook for free is because we've given all our data away. It's bizarre. It's the data economy has gone crazy as a result of mass centralization, and at the same time you've got this move to decentralized markets, so the shared economies and stuff like that. And blockchain's sort of in the mix in some of that. I'll explain the relationship in a sec. So imagine you're doing this game using Ethereum, and you get 1 million users. And you set off a game, and it's a really attractive game, and they all want to be on the game at the same time. Well, I'm sorry, but it only does 100 TPS. So there'll be a lot of buffering and waiting. So it just doesn't scale for things like that. So there's been a need to, one of the beautiful things about blockchain is it has provenance inbuilt. So truth is an easier concept to grasp, because you can see how data got changed along the way. You never lose it. Nobody can go in the data center and reverse that and change it. You have to change history to do that. And that's very, very computationally expensive. In fact, so expensive that nobody would do it. So that's one of the reasons why blockchain is interesting in the world we live in today. And when you think about voting and what's going on in the States, the trust in a voting system, it is, clearly, certainly with Donald Trump, that he's able to suggest that there's illegalities going on. Well, if you have a blockchain that supports identity, where you own your identity, not the government owns your identity, you own your identity. But your identity is guaranteed to be you.
And this is such an interesting topic and a point that we will talk about. And I think from the world looking in at what's gone on in the US and seeing the backlash from the voting system at the moment, you and I are both sitting here thinking there's an easier option for us to resolve this type of issue, which I'm sure you're going to talk about at some point. So from my perspective, hearing how blockchain can assist in everyday life, just one topic and one area. So for voting, for example, for me, I want to know what benefits blockchain will have, not just for voting, but for medicine, for finance, for all the goals that we want to achieve, how much clarity we'll have from using such a tool. Obviously a divisive tool, but a tool nonetheless that can achieve greater things than what the current infrastructure is allowing us to achieve. The voting element, I think, will be good for us maybe to cover off now, if you can.
I'm going to cover both of those.
Yeah,
But
okay.
bear with me for literally 30 seconds.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
worried my power's going to go off.
Okay, no
I'm
problem.
just going to plug in my power and I'm going to
Yeah,
come
sure.
back to both.
Back when
Now,
you're ready.
right, so to come back to these two, it's funny that you should pick the two of them. Because, so I'm working with a couple of doctors on the COVID passport.
Yes.
Right? And the big issue with the COVID passport, conspiracy theories abound about, Bill Gates is going to inoculate us and somehow track us forevermore. I mean, this is the grand conspiracy theories that you see on the internet all the time.
Mind control.
Oh, it's incredible. So we wanted to make sure, could we create a self-sovereign identity that represents me or you, that we control ourselves, in which we permission people to see as much or as little of the information that is recorded about us under our identity. And that's really important because it transcends national boundaries and transcends the sort of geopolitic that exists in the world. And it is perfect as something to be sponsored by something like the WHO, which has no axe to grind with any one country, right? And it turns out, if you could have a blockchain that scales, and if you could have a smart contracting language that really it enables you to do what we call object capability, it's really quite a simple thing to do. So I think in the next 3 weeks, I think RChain will be demonstrating such a capability as a demo, not as an MVP. An MVP might follow later. But blockchain's brilliant for it because all countries, all individuals can choose to participate, right? So,
and how would it work?
So imagine you got your phone. So you got your phone and you go to your doctor and, or maybe you don't have your phone. You go to the doctor and the doctor says, I'll give you a test or I'll give you COVID-19 vaccination. So the doctor gets the smartphone, scans in the barcode on the vaccination, right? Which immediately pulls up the key attributes that are required and then asks you for your ID. So if you've got your phone, you can kind of bump one phone against the other, right? So you've then said, here's my ID. And then the ID gets added to the package. And then the package gets sent to the blockchain and stored in my data vault. If I'm the subject, gets stored in my data vault. Now, because it's a blockchain, the data is encrypted. I'm the one with the keys. I get to permission people to see that data or not. And so I could have a default version of the app that, so the doctor's filled in the detail, but suddenly on my app, it's appeared. Right, it says Steve Ross-Talbot got the vaccine on. This was the vaccine, and he should be valid for 6 months. And might be a green dot or a tick against my picture that says yes, free to travel, whatever. Now, of course, I may choose not to show that to people, and that's my prerogative.
Yes.
Equally, I may choose to allow anyone to look at both my testing and vaccination records for COVID-19, but without ever knowing my name and only knowing, say, my gender and age group. So I don't want to give them my age because I don't want them to know my date of birth. But I can tell them that I'm, over 60. And I know, but nobody will believe that I'm over 60. I know, but
I was going to say.
It's actually true. That's what's worrying. So I'm probably at risk. But the point being is that I control it. I control it. Same with voting. So with voting, I control the vote. It's my vote. It's locked in my vault. But the vote counting mechanism has the ability to go to each vault and say, can you tell me what you voted for? It doesn't say, who are you? It says, can you just tell me if you voted what you voted for? None of the data about me is taken in a blockchain voting implementation, but the counter can count all the votes and then say on this date, or this time, when I finish counting, this was the number of votes for these different topics. And the beauty is you can't go back and change the votes.
I was going to say, for that point, and this will be something that our listeners are probably thinking, well, surely if we have bots already that are liking on Facebook, sharing media, creating pages, how is that more secure than the current system at the moment?
The blockchain one is, it's more secure because you can't have false identity.
Okay.
So there's a KYC onto the chain.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you have, in our chain, in almost every blockchain that you go to, if you're going to do anything with a blockchain, you will have to KYC.
Yes.
So if you get interoperability of blockchains, then you can then start to look for a single unified identity.
Mm-hmm.
So I am me, I'm always me. It doesn't matter which blockchain I'm on.
So simply put, if to know your customer and know your client, it's a video of your face, a screen recognition, and you're into the blockchain. Passport, yeah.
Date, and something about who you are. I mean, the usual thing that you have to do, and that's digitized and locked up with your identity.
Yeah.
As part of the KYC process. So there's no way of people doing it it's very hard to do it fraudulently. I mean, it's possible. I mean, if you used finger vein technology, so, take a 3D image of your finger, but the finger vein, that's actually more unique. It's a much higher level of uniqueness than, say, your iris or your fingerprint, for that matter. Very hard to do fraudulent things.
Very hard.
So
yes, please. Sorry.
So it's more secure in the sense that it's very you can't change history. So there's provenance. So if somebody tries to change something using your identity, it will be seen. Right? And if it's then challenged by anyone that's validating a new block, then it will never pass muster. And because blockchain itself isn't the answer. It's the use of blockchain. The use of blockchain to have a vault for your identity and all the things about you that you care about, not that other people care about. It's what you care about that matters. And this is a fundamental aspect of why Satoshi did blockchain in the first place.
Yeah.
It was really saying to the rest of the world, well, we don't need a large corporate entity to issue currency, to issue some abstract notion of value, which is all a pound or a dollar is. It's not like a pound is really worth a pound. It's not like a dollar is really worth a dollar. It's just that, these fiat currencies have a backing so that they're unlikely to go to zero. Turns out that actually blockchain has an asset that backs it too, but most people don't realize that the asset's there because it's very low grade, and that asset is the transaction volume.
Yes.
Right? If the transaction, so this is one of the interesting things about why blockchain needs to be able to do more than 100 TPS. If it's doing 40,000 TPS, more like Visa, the chances that the pipe runs dry at any minute is very unlikely, in the same way that the chances that that Fort Knox is robbed of all its gold, that's just as unlikely. So the scale, the scalability of blockchain is fundamental to its long-term stability. The higher the numbers of TPS it can do, without there being any sacrifice in decentralized and distributed trust, so the asset has a better risk profile, and there'll be less fluctuation in its price. Speculators will still be speculators, but they can't. They can speculate more in a world where there seemingly isn't an asset backing a currency, because they can speculate all the way to zero. They just can't do that with pounds.
And with the transactions at the moment running at, as you say, around 100, the increase over time, that's going to be down to user adoption, but also the infrastructure, I guess, has to be improved. What's the blocker at the moment as to why it's not growing at the rate that it needs to, or is it growing at the rate it needs to?
I'd say there's two impediments. One is technical, and the other is a kind of, for want of a better word, a mindset.
Hmm.
So the technical one is this notion of proof of work. I mean, the beauty of Satoshi's paper and blockchain was this notion of decentralized trust. You know, he solved, or at least gave a solution to the Byzantine generals problem, famous distributed problem, distributed computing problem, that underpins the notion of trust. And what he put together was an algorithm that we call proof of work that enables us to algorithmically encode trust, so that when a block is proposed with lots of transactions in it and is sent to what are called miners, the miners add up, check the previous block, add up all the transactions in the block and reach a consensus. It's a consensus algorithm. And the consensus says, well, if 51% of you agree, then that's the truth. That's where truth lies. And therefore, that's the block that will stamp, that one goes. And by the way, out of the 20 miners that agreed to, that made up the 51%, one of you is going to get a Bitcoin for your work. Mm. So this is how mining works. Mm. And the problem is that in that journey, when they do that, they have to solve a cryptographic problem. It's kind of to prove their worthiness so that they're not anyone. And that cryptographic problem is a completely arbitrary cryptographic problem.
And different every time, or?
It gets more complex.
Okay.
It actually gets more complex. It was simpler at the beginning, but every epoch it gets more complex, and the number of Bitcoin you get rewarded, if you're lucky enough, halves. Mm. So it both gets more complex and you get less. Now, at some point, miners will give up. But what happened over time? Satoshi did this because he wanted it to be a sort of democratic, decentralized world. Well, of course, what happens is if this cryptographic problem that you're going to solve is really complex, well, the answer is, I've got lots of money. Let me buy a floating point array, because it will do the cryptographic problem faster than that guy there with a MacBook Pro, right? And so 99,000 times, 99,999 times, it will win over the MacBook Pro. And therefore, they'll, you know, if you've got enough capital behind you, this is how mining syndicates were created. Yeah. You buy all these floating point arrays. There's a great one in Greenland and or Iceland that's run by some guys. And you start being the dominant miner. Now, what that does is it changes the philosophy behind Satoshi's paper. Satoshi wanted a much more uniform, heterogeneous plane. And what this does is it causes lumpy gravitational shifts. Mm. And so we're almost back to the notion of an issuer, like the Bank of England. Yeah, it's not just the Bank of England. It's now lots of Bank of Englands that are not regulated, and you've got no idea who they are, but they're the ones determining truth. Now, as it turns out,
would you say that this is almost reminiscent of the gold rush of many years ago, where now we have lots of people looking at an opportunity to create wealth? Mining is becoming almost an industrious part of many different companies' schemes, and like you say, it's moving away from that the notion that Satoshi has put in place, and it's causing issues.
Yes, it is, and it is because it's entirely because in order to solve the cryptographic problem, you have to bet electricity. That's really what you're doing. You're betting thermodynamics. And so he who can afford to spend more electricity will end up winning. Completely works against what Satoshi wanted. And it's totally the gold rush. It's exactly the same. If you think about the gold rush, it started to unravel when the seams became too small and the amount of kit you needed too big. It's exactly the same. The parallel is uncanny. So along comes, Ethereum, it's the same, proof of work. So, all of the great and the good in the blockchain world decided we need a better way, because it turns out that Bitcoin's blockchain alone spends as much energy as the entire island of Ireland every day. If you
Incredible.
If you look at the more than 3,000 proof of work based blockchains in the world, if they all grew to the same size as Bitcoin's blockchain, it is 3 times larger than the total amount of energy that the world produces today.
Crikey, that's scary.
Yeah, it is when you put those numbers. Now, of course not, they won't all make it anyway, and they won't all make it even close. But the fact that we're even contemplating just, why bet thermodynamics? So what happened probably about 10 years ago is the great and the good. Greg Meredith from RChain being one of the great and the good, who was working with Ethereum at the time, but he wasn't alone. There were several people thinking along the same way. They were thinking kind of the same thing here. Why are we betting thermodynamics? Let's turn it on its head. Why don't we make this betting? Why don't we just bet a token and not solve a cryptographic problem? And that's proof of stake. So where proof of work requires you to secretly bet thermodynamics in the vain hope, if you've got enough CPU power, you'll get awarded a Bitcoin. Proof of stake says, well, actually, if you think you're so clever, put 1,000 tokens up as your stake. And if you then get the proposed block and you check that it's the right block, check all the numbers, and 51% agree with you, you won't lose your stake. But if you add it up wrongly, then we will assume you're malicious and you will lose your stake. So the stake goes into a common pool and distributed as tokens again. And so there's a carrot and stick. Instead of you getting a Bitcoin as a miner, what you get is a reward of a transaction fee, a percentage of the size of the transactions of the block goes to you as the validator. But that percentage is really tiny, right? So it's like 0.1%. Whereas if you try to do something on an exchange right now with cryptocurrencies, you're going to get charged 1%, and in some cases much more. I mean, PayPal, what does PayPal charge? About 3-4%?
Yeah, about that.
And that's not crypto. So, but the same point, it's about doing transactions at a lower cost ultimately. So proof of stake comes along and says, let's just turn the entire algorithm of consensus on its head and force people to stake. And if they're wrong, they lose. And if they're right, there'll be an algorithm that disperses the transaction fees according to some algorithm based on the amount of tokens that you are going to stake over time. So you put a commitment in. So you still get gravitational forces and sort of validator pools, but what it does is it allows people with far less means to be part of that picture. Far less. I mean, you could almost be a validator off your iPhone. Yeah. Right? Where there's not a chance you could do that with proof of work. No. Your iPhone will melt. Yeah. So when you solve that problem and you start solving, and this was the point I really wanted to make about blockchain really, and how you have to reimagine a lot of things. When you start solving those problems so that the issues of proof of work go away, scale goes away, and that blockchain really is nothing other than, if you like, a kind of a global compute resource that's tokenized, where you can put a token in, something will run, something may get stored, something may get read, but you're paying in some token for what it is that's going on. What you start to have to do, this is the reimagination bit, is it's how you then decentralize things. Blockchain is about decentralization of issuance, of currency, right? Decentralization of consensus to arrive at truth. These are easy things to think about. These are easier things to think about than to think about something that's in our normal lives. So, for instance, how do I truly decentralize New York taxis? Right? When you look at the sharing economy, you look at Uber, you look at Airbnb, you look at all of these. What really happened there? Question mark. So I'm going to answer my own question. So what happened was, Web 2.0 came of age because it enabled people that were centralizing authorities in their marketplace to reach out wider through the internet. That's why Airbnb works. But Airbnb What they win out on is, of course, because they've got great scale because they were in there early enough, and the same with Uber, and the same with with lots of others, Netflix being another. They talk about the sort of sharing economy, but it's, they like to think that they're empowering the sharing economy. Well, they do, but they charge a very large slice for doing so. Right? Musicians typically on Spotify get very, very, very little.
Yes.
Taxi drivers, they kind of like the independence, and that's kind of how they kept on side a lot of the time. But they don't step back and think, well, hang on a minute, this isn't right. Right? If they did, they would realize, hang on a minute, I'm the guy delivering the value.
Yeah.
The guy with the server, he's not. Why is he charging so much? And why do I get no holidays? All of this, right? So what these great Web 2.0 companies did was they did a couple of things that were very, very clever technically. Netflix, another one. First of all, they were brilliant at doing agile delivery. They were brilliant at taking advantage of microservices so that they could introduce features almost like a drug to the market to get people hooked and to try out things and to steer into a place where they could really dominate and then just grow really big. I mean, the old adage, right? Scale fast. Right? Fail fast, scale quick, I think is actually the term. That's kind of why. Well, when you now look at where that's got us, what you've now got is that by and large, the consumer essentially is giving data to all of these companies for almost nothing, usually
Nothing.
Right? The provider of the service is essentially given a small amount, but an illusion of freedom and independence. And these companies get exceedingly rich. And when you look at the growth pattern, right, we're now at the point of what Miko Matsumori calls peak centralization. We're at peak centralization with oil. In fact, we passed that a while back, peak oil. We're now at peak data.
Yes. I think we're all now the result of mining of data. There's not a lot left to be shared.
That's right. And the data is ours. The biggest scare for all of these companies, the biggest scare. And it's interesting when you look at the British politics as well around this, was GDPR.
Yeah.
Right? Scared Facebook like crazy. Dominic Cummings is not a lover of GDPR because it locks him out of gaining access to data that isn't his and is about other people. So the idea, coming back to blockchain, of owning our own identity and really owning it and monetizing it. So when you think of the sharing economy, think now of the sharing data economy. So blockchain, I think, is going to be the biggest but the biggest technology in helping to enable the sharing data economy, in which every single one of us, for instance, when we see an advert, if you're watching something on YouTube, right? So I sometimes watch old black and white movies on YouTube, and it will interrupt me with an ad, and I completely ignore it, wait for it, says skip.
4 seconds, goodbye.
Right? But every time that happens, there's an advertising framework that's spending, in effect, coinage from the advertiser, the sponsor content, and who's getting the money?
YouTube.
Exactly. I get nothing, and yet I'm the person expected to watch it. If I'm the only people that get anything really is YouTube and influencers. So if in a sharing economy, we would get a little tiny piece of that advertising budget for actually saying, well, we will watch it. And that changes the nature of that, of why those companies got big. Imagine Uber and all of those, and Spotify and YouTube, if they didn't have the advertising frameworks, they'd have to charge they'd have to have a different charging model.
Well,
they'd still get money. Absolutely, but it would be distributed better.
Yeah, I was in a restaurant not so long ago, a local restaurant. I won't name the name, but collecting food, and they have a subscription or they work in conjunction with a delivery app, and they take over 50% of the cost of the food. So you're effectively running at a loss before you've even delivered or cooked the food. It's scary. And not only that, the people that are ordering this food are also paying over the odds on the app. So the guys at the top are the ones that are not only getting all your data and all the food that you're ordering, what your choices are, you're spending money on the food. The end customer who you're buying the food from is getting a terrible deal. And you're quite right. We're now at this point, we're at the peak of where our data can go now. I think it's been sold across every corners of the earth. Everybody knows everybody. We get pop-ups on our phone to go on a nice skiing holiday when we talk about it in our sleep. And for me, it's becoming a point now where there has to be a switch, and there has to be some point where our data becomes, I wouldn't say valueless, but certainly not as expensive or as a necessity for these big companies, because everybody has it. So I think, are you saying that blockchain can be that decentralization or that protective measure in place to protect people like you and me, to protect our data, to support the smaller firms in commerce and Joe Public like myself?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, it's I mean, maybe. I mean, it would take an entirely separate conversation, really, to go through that. But RChain's working on an advertising framework. There are advertising frameworks out there in blockchain land. There's a few of them, but they all suffer from the same sort of problems in that the content is never stored on chain. The transactionality of the content, so who gets paid what, where, how, that flow is handled on chain. So Ethereum is okay for that, but you couldn't, for instance, use Ethereum to store real-time video and then serve it out.
Definitely not.
Right? So you need a blockchain that can do that. Now, if you have a blockchain that can do that, then it does a couple of things. First of all, yes, you can do all the accounting side, right? That's the easy bit. But it means not only can you serve the content up from the chain, but there's a guarantee that there will never, ever be a 404. You'll never get a 404 on a web page again, because that web page will never go away. Right? Now, it also means that when you change something, you've got the lineage. Imagine being able to click on anything, like an advert, like a piece of sponsored content. You're not quite sure why. Why is that on this page? Why did I get that? GDPR says you should be able to ask that question, but nobody's actually able to answer it. If you had a blockchain, which has perfect provenance inbuilt, it's a first-class object in blockchain, you get that for free.
So I wanted to go back to our first topic, and this is kind of looking at a digital democracy, shall we say? And I think the key thing for this subject is to understand the importance of fairness in any democracy, and also giving the public complete what's the word I'm looking for?
You want transparency in everything.
Transparency, absolutely that. Yeah, to know where your vote's going and to know that it's a trusted source where you're voting. And I think for me, there's also lots of people out there that would be for and against moving to a digital voting system. There's also pros to what we have currently. There's cons, of course, right now. If you look at the Brexit vote, I hate to bring it up, but we look at it and the disparity between fors and against. It was evident that certain locations were for, certain locations were against, but it was such a close call. Digital voting system, we may have had a very different result. More people would have come out and voted. It would have given opportunity for people that potentially couldn't get down to the voting booth, that could have done it in their own leisure. And we may have a completely different result because of this. But over to you on that point. How far away are we from getting to that stage in our world where digital voting becomes the norm? Do you see that as the next generation? Do you see that happening?
It's largely driven by the number of elections that are required to forget who's in. It's an election cycle, so it's certainly not part of this government's agenda. Whoever forms the government next time, maybe it will be part of their agenda. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn, bizarrely enough, I was involved in the writing of the digital manifesto for the Labour Party. And we trialled digital democracy. We didn't use blockchain. We used a technology called Polis, POL.is.
Okay.
It's centralized though, centralized database kind of thing on the web. So, the issue there was trust. We trusted Polis, the company, knew them really well. But over time, you don't know who's going to be there. So you need trust that's beyond that boundary.
Yeah.
What Polis did was really clever. And I think when you take that and apply it onto a blockchain plane that scales, then it makes sense. Because it's not the act of voting. It's interesting, you mentioned Brexit. It's not the act of voting. It wasn't the vote that ended up making the decision whether we stayed or left. It was the narrative that led up to the vote and how truthful or not that narrative was. So it's no good just having a voting system. What you need is provenance of the deliberation that takes place before you even vote. Right? If you have that, so if you imagine having a Twitter or a Facebook Messenger where people chat, or just Facebook, where you like and do. Imagine you've got a deliberation mechanism, and imagine that mechanism can give you a graphical view by some sort of, I don't know, maybe street view, maybe constituency view, maybe ward view, maybe national view of how everyone was thinking. Right? So if you imagine it as Venn diagram kind of stuff, O-level maths, right? So it might be that there's two set circles a long way apart. Stay, leave.
Yeah. Right?
But there's a lot of stuff in the middle that you start to see. So then you, as a citizen, decide, I'm going to enter this debate. I haven't said anything yet. And you get onto your thing and you put something in. And what you're seeing is the shape of the debate in real time. This is what Polis does that's so very clever.
Yeah.
And it impacts how people react to the debate. So it forces people to figure out where's the common ground. Rather than the polarization that we saw that happened, it forces common ground.
It's almost, it's a natural poll, I guess, from the individuals that are talking or debating on this app, Polis.
Think of it like an audience where you do that poll, right? And you say, all those in favour, and they all put their hands up, and they're all sitting in one corner.
Yes.
And then you say, who wants to leave? If that's the stay, who wants to leave? And they all put their hands up. You say, well, would you guys like to mingle a bit? This is what it does. I mean, we saw this with the Labour Party trial, that we postulated a number of questions to within the Labour Party. One of which was, should there be a tax on robots, right? And the other was, which was a similar question, but coming from a different end, should we move to universal basic income? Right, so these two, they're actually highly related because one could fill the other. What was really interesting is that the discussion started physically at a ward level, as it were, oddly enough in a lecture theatre at the University of Westminster, and it continued for 3 months thereafter, online, on the phone, even on the phone, as I was walking to London Bridge Station, still looking at my phone, entranced by seeing this debate of about 300 people. And then you see more added to it. So a deliberation mechanism that has that, but is trusted, that it has provenance, right? So you can take something back that you said, but you can't delete what you said.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can say, well, no, I didn't really mean that. Or no, I was wrong. I admit I was wrong. That over there was wrong. And so when people see that you say that, and yes, that's actually in fact the truth, they tend to trust you more.
Okay.
Right. So if you have that provenance built into the deliberation, right, the voting's easy. The voting's the easy bit. The key is the deliberation that leads up to it. Because if you have a voting mechanism that's digital, but you don't deal with the deliberation and the way in which the truth can be manipulated, then you're going to lose out.
Yeah, exactly.
Something that's worth watching, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a brilliant thing on Netflix at the moment about social media.
Oh, yes. I forget what it's called.
If anyone listens to this podcast, watch it. And then sit back and then consider how long will it be before you leave Facebook after you watch that.
So it's the is it Insta Famous or is it another one? I'm trying to think. I think it's about how they mine our data. Is that right? Or
it's about how they mine our data and how they manipulate us. And it's that's, you see, when you have the provenance,
the social dilemma.
That's it. So when you have provenance inbuilt into the deliberations, right? Let's say we have a deliberation mechanism, a DApp, right, built on the blockchain for deliberation, but we add sponsored content to it, just as Facebook do, right? So there's this sponsored content appears before my very eyes. I've been talking about whatever subject it is. I should be able to click on that and say, why have you sent me this? Right? And then it should be able to answer, well, I sent you this because. I mean, GDPR suggests that you should be able to do this anyway, but I know very few companies that do it.
No.
But it is quite explicit in GDPR that you should be able to tell people why, what you're doing with their data. So if their data is input to some AI algorithm, you should be able to tell them that. The AI algorithm itself should be able to explain why it did what it did.
I've seen this program and the social dilemma program you mentioned. And one thing that scared me about it was how they manipulate you as you're using their app, send notifications when they need you to see stuff, push notifications about what your friends are doing, memories, this addictive kind of content that gets pushed to your phone. It's worrying because all they want you to do is open it so they can show you adverts. That's it. And for me, that is a big no-no from GDPR perspective, but I see that nothing's really been getting done about it.
There's something you can do practically on an everyday level. And it's hard to do, but it's a really good test. Which is, you have to make, it's kind of a bit like the alcoholic and saying, don't drink for a while. Stay off Facebook. Actually, don't log into Facebook for a period of time. Try it for a month. What happens behind the scenes is it resets everything.
Really?
Yeah, it's a good experiment.
There you are, listeners. Bit of a tip there. So I will do this for a month and I will see what happens. I'm not a huge fan of Facebook, but I will definitely try and see what happens and I'll let you know the results. I'm currently being, lots of adverts are coming to me, mainly around jumpers and scarves because it's Christmas. Sorry, Dad, that's what you're getting for Christmas. I've just spoiled it. Okay, so regarding the voting system, of course, it's a big topic and it's something that we could pull apart over days, months, weeks. Your involvement in it up until now has been mainly around the digital elements, or have you been involved? How have you been involved, or when did you get involved into the voting system?
I think it was 1978.
Okay. You first voted?
Yes, I voted for a guy called Jez Fox. He was a member of the Raving Monster Loony Party in Dover.
Oh, yes, I remember them.
And he ran down Dover High Street with a copy of the Dover Express, somehow stuffed between his butt cheeks, set alight. And he did it to show how stupid the National Front were, on the basis that he would get more votes than them. And he did. So he mission accomplished. And it was the election that I think Mrs. Thatcher won. That was my first foray into voting. Now, voting is an interesting thing because, you know, the Trump days have challenged, you know, even my inner beliefs. So I'm half South African. So I come from a history where my South African side of my family, Cape Coloured, were not allowed to vote until South Africa, you know, won its freedom in you know, after when Mandela was released in 1992. And I was heavily involved in some of that, working closely with the ANC. So I have this thing about give people what they want. However, as a software person who's, you know, been an entrepreneur and done lots of interesting things and tried to come up with new things, sometimes users don't quite know what they want, right? So there's a dilemma here. Give people what they want, but do they know what they want? What the social dilemma does is tell us what we want. And what we do is often fail to check that that is what we want.
Yeah.
And we don't always embrace the notion of democracy. I do, actually. I still do. I passionately believe that, you know, every vote should count. You know, it's ironic that I'm saying this in this year of the US election. Every vote should count. And, you know, and you shouldn't have to vote once every 5 years. You should be able to vote more in the style of Swiss cantons.
Yeah.
And it should be, voting should be applied both locally and nationally as you wish as a voter. And one of the consequences of digital democracy, I believe, and we'll see if this happens, but it'd be an interesting one to reflect back on. If you have digital democracy where you change the notion of our democracy from a representative democracy to something that is more participatory and in partnership with representative democracy, then what is the role of political parties? It calls into question, as it should, the role of political parties. And it was quite interesting when I did this with the Labour Party, because I'm not sure that many people in the Labour Party, one, really understood that actually in supporting the notion of digital democracy, which definitely Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, bizarrely enough, I don't understand either. Well, I understand John McDonnell more. I don't understand Jeremy Corbyn at all, really. But I do know he's a passionate Democrat. He didn't do the things I wanted. The reason, oddly enough, that he said broadband should be free, he said it for the wrong reasons, in my opinion, but it was in the digital manifesto. Because if you have broadband for free, then it's easier to envisage digital democracy being rolled out. If you don't have it for free, then you're requiring people to pay to vote. So it makes complete sense for me, from my perspective, to have broadband as a free utility.
Yes.
Or at least available to you when you want to vote. So when you come back to blockchains and how they run smart contracts and they kind of like use utility tokens, you should be given the utility tokens by the government, the infrastructure, to at least vote. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can, you know, watch Netflix for free.
No, you'll have access to the app or the website that will enable you to be able to cast your vote for a certain period of time. You have 30 days and off you go.
I mean, in terms of when this is available, when this would be possible, the digital democracy pre-blockchain, so before blockchain-based solutions, like Polis, they're out there. They've been out there for a while. The Taiwanese have been using Polis for a long time. about a third of all policy is decided by the electorate directly using polis, and then harvested from polis by the government. So it's this partnership of participatory and representative democracy in a way that we haven't really seen before. And I know Norway's trying it. Sweden and Denmark have been trying it. What's been missing is the blockchain aspect in a scalable way.
I was going to ask as well. So the main you're probably hearing the main challenges at the moment from those countries, because of course they're further ahead than we are. But what can you see are the main issues or main challenges for digital voting?
I have a concern that, for want of a better word, the forces of centralization, which includes political parties, have a vested interest in not making it happen. And this is where Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were a bit weird, right? As leader and deputy leader of a political party. There they were, proclaiming the digital manifesto, at least when they're talking to that side of the room. When they talk to that side of the room, which is the vast majority of people, there was, it wasn't coming through. They weren't saying it.
No.
And I don't know how much of that was just to keep us on side over here, and how real they were. But there has to be this notion of, you need people, strong leaders, who believe in the importance of both participation in democracy. And there's no reason not to have it. I mean, the only reason we have representative democracy was because it was impossible to have voting all the time.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true anymore. So we need to figure out how we do that. And in the same way, I mean, it's the same challenge to the great centralized marketplaces and moving to decentralized marketplaces. The centralists will fight tooth and nail. You see it every day. Look at who Microsoft have acquired over the years. Look at who Facebook have acquired over the years. If there's anyone that will challenge their centrist view, they tend to want to gobble them up. So you need a company that has a decentralizing view that's not prepared to sell out.
Yeah.
And that requires great leadership. That's not easy to find. In the IT world, there are not many. I could barely name 6. And of the 6 I could name, one of them's dead, and that would be Steve Jobs. Right? And Bill Gates too. Bill Gates is not a centralist. He may have got rich off it, but it isn't fundamentally what he believes in.
No, his shareholders are, though.
His shareholders are, yeah. And Jobs, certainly at the end of his life, in the last year or 2 of his life, when he knew he had pancreatic cancer, totally, he was about the power of the individual. And I think that's where it has to be. People have to rise up. So the beauty of blockchain and decentralizing dApps, right, that can be rolled out, is that it may happen under the radar. And if it gets established, if blockchain, the centralists tried to shut down all the blockchain companies.
Yeah.
The US government's tried to shut it down. The Federal Reserve's tried to shut it down. They have totally failed. The cat's out the cat's out the bag. And I think with the advent of things like platform co-ops, which is quite important, fundamental, Europe's spending a lot of money, the EU's spending a lot of money in platform co-ops. They will want to use blockchain technology because they need to have a decentralizing platform where there's no central ownership.
But you can't have it both ways, because if you're introducing such a tool into the system and it works, then unfortunately they're going to be out of a job very soon if it continues to progress in the way that we hope it does. Because at some point you're having this digital form of voting, this decision making that ultimately is agreeing either on policies or the referendum or a change in power. All these things then kind of remove the need to have a political debate and have the MPs all in power or whoever. Do you see that? Do you see that as a transition, or is that too drastic?
I see it as an evolution. So, centralization's got us a very long way.
Yeah.
Right. it's not that centralization in and of itself is bad. It's just gone too far.
It's gone too far. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So I think it is this notion of, given the technology we have at our disposal today, and over the next 10 years, what I'd like to believe will happen is that the representatives that represent us will evolve. And we will evolve as well. However, the lead of that evolution will be from the participatory side, less than it will be the representative side. Some representatives will see it, but there'll be many more laggards there. But as more and more people become aware of the power that they have as participants in democracy at a local level, and then eventually at a global level, so you should see change. I mean, the superpower we have as human beings is our ability to communicate, and oddly enough, our ability to collaborate. Without those two things, we would be history already. Now we've got technology. Now, maybe now is that it. I think we're at that threshold, and I think it gives rise to what James Lovelock, the great, the guy behind climate science, really, who's I think 101 now, living in Devon.
Wow.
He said, act locally, but think globally. So I think if you're going to have digital democracy take off, it will be locally. I could see Brighton doing it, right? Under Caroline Lucas, totally. Sure. Right? And then if you can do it locally and then roll it out, you can start rolling out to some other constituencies. And before you know it, you've got a couple of constituencies where maybe, 2/3 or 1/3 of all the policy making decisions from that constituency are coming from the constituents, and about 1/3 is coming from the representative. Now, where you draw the line, Taiwan draw the line on the basis of, well, policing and military and certain other things, I can't remember what they were. This is what the representatives will do.
And I think that has to be comparable to us as well. We can't allow the public to decide who we go to war with.
Whereas education and healthcare and social care, these are the things that people will want more likely to participate in a more active way. There will always be people that want to go to war with another country, and there may even be more than one of them wanting to go to war with a particular country. But we'll put those to the side. That's not the dominant.
Yes.
Dominant will be, hey, look, my kids, my health, and my parents and grandparents. It will revolve around that. So I think you'll see that happen over time.
And for me, what's really interesting is that we now have a technology that is capable of allowing us to make this shift. Of course, blockchain is now involved, but why did it make that shift into something like a digital democracy? Why is it now we're talking about this as a subject?
Oh, I think I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, blockchain, like every technology we've known, right? Blockchain has had a hype cycle, a massive hype cycle.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, suddenly, I just remember when the web came out, in the very late 1990s, CIOs and CEOs up and all over the country were suddenly running around like headless chickens, saying, "We need to have an internet policy." I mean, they didn't even know what it was, right? So we need to have a shop front on the web, but how are people going to buy? Don't know. We'll solve that one later. and blockchain was, and so that's why the web. I mean, REST was born out of this. The web wasn't meant to do RESTful transactions. What happened was somebody figured out a way of doing RESTful transactions on the web, right? But it wasn't what the web was intended for, I can assure you. I think the same has been true of blockchain. What's happened with blockchain is a lot of investors have spent a lot of money probably lost a lot of money as well. A lot of companies poo-pooed the idea originally, including people like IBM, who then suddenly are all over it like a rash, but saying,
Yes.
and typical of IBM, what IBM's done is they would say that Hyperledger, for instance, is a blockchain. Right, so they're very good at trying to redefine terms. But a real blockchain, a public blockchain, proper blockchain, with decentralized trust, that's a blockchain, like Bitcoins, like Ethereum, and so on. Hyperledger is not, because there is at least one trusted node. Right? Now, if you want to scale and you trust nobody, it's hard. The minute you trust one, I can give you millions of transactions a second. Just depends on how big my one is. But going to zero, I trust nobody, and yet somehow I can transact with them and it's safe. Wow. Doing it through an intermediary is easy. And that's what Hyperledger does. And that is not a blockchain. And typical of IBM and others, they will conflate the term and try and own it. And those that really understand the nature, and that's the beauty of Satoshi's paper, I think, that, I mean, it's worth a read. Satoshi's paper is always worth a read. It's a very easy read. And it's the philosophy behind it. Why do this? Because that, in answering that why and realizing the why, then you understand that blockchain algorithmically represents some notion of trust. And it is algorithmic. And there is no individual, nobody can do anything fraudulently. It gives you some degree of sense that when something gets written, it's never gonna, nobody will be able to change it. And so it makes you be, I mean, there's a number of challenges. I mean, for those that are interested in sort of microservices and that whole genre of technology, blockchain runs counter to it. Because in microservices, what you should be doing is doing lots of versions of a microservice. You do version 1, think, oh no, version 2. Well, don't go back to version 1 and change it and then re-release it. Really, what you should do is start with a clean slate, do version 2, then release it. And over time, version 1 is strangled using a strangler pattern, right? So if you think of those as smart contracts, well, in a blockchain, the smart contracts are never strangled into non-existence.
No.
They are there forever. So you kind of, with microservices, you can experiment a bit. You can do A/B testing. You can stand a new microservice up, test it with the population and find, oh dear me, it failed a bit here, there and everywhere. It did some wrong things. Well, with the smart contract, you have to be more wary of that, because if the smart contract does some things that are wrong, maybe what it did was debit your account in the wrong way, and that might be a bit tragic. So blockchain development with smart contracts has all of the attributes that you expect from a CDCI pipeline of microservices, but it has to have rigor that you don't have to have with just straightforward microservices. More lenient. Blockchains aren't. Yeah. How do you back out a smart contract? The answer is you don't.
You don't. No. So if we were going to, you and I tomorrow, move to a digital democracy, our little country of 50 million people, however many, what role would a blockchain play in meeting those requirements and
national
helping?
Ledger of deliberation.
Okay.
It's the national ledger of results of every single vote. And that would be, if you imagine sharding it by ward and constituency, right? Then it should enable somebody from a ward to look at the voting patterns in that ward. And if they are the representative of that ward, they should be acting on the basis of the constituents that have put them in office at ward level, and then at constituency level, and then at national level. So it would be that ledger. And when these people turn up on question time or any answers or any questions or anything like that, they say, why did you do that? Then there can only be two answers. Well, as your representative, I blah, 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 or as your representative, I checked what the participants wanted, the constituents wanted, and they wanted this. And then somebody can say, prove it. And they can say, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
So what it will do, oddly enough, for the representative, it's actually good news, because if they could do that, and,
well, they'll never be called into account.
Lying, I think it engenders trust. They become more trusted, not less.
Yeah, it's a clear transaction. Makes perfect sense. Well, I hope it happens in our lifetime and that we see it sooner rather than later. I definitely feel as though we're at that point now where something needs to give. Certainly after what we've seen over the last, I'd probably go as far as to say the last two national elections in the US, and certainly in the UK as well, with the referendum and other votes that we've had over the last few years. It's certainly something of interest of mine, and I think you're spot on in terms of what it will give us, the public, in terms of that trust, and also it will put the politicians back into a position of civil service, which is what we need.
Yes, absolutely. They would be serving the interests of the people that they represent in a fundamental way. Exactly. Wouldn't that be amazing? Good Lord.
It would. Well, Steve, thank you very much. This has been enlightening and very interesting fact-finding conversation. I hope to all the listeners that are tuning into this have found it as interesting as I have. Of course, this will be a topic of conversation for many more months to come. And again, I thank you for joining me on the podcast this evening and taking time out of your evening. So thank you very much. Again, it's been very interesting. I'm sure there are some afterthoughts there for a lot of us. But the key topic for me, key takeaways for me, is that we're almost at tipping point when it comes to the mining of our data and the regulatory compliance that's in place at the moment is not currently protecting the rights of the public. And I feel as though the decentralization in certain areas of our everyday life is required to support us and to support common marketplace, e-commerce and industry and the smaller businesses. And who knows where it can take us. It's a very exciting time, and to hear you talk about it so passionately. And I know you're heavily involved with RChain and supporting a lot of other movements in this space. It's very interesting, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
It's a pleasure. If there's interest to perhaps, if anything happens in the space over the next 6 to 12 months, where there is something really solid to show. So, it's easy to talk about it, but it really, really gels when you see some stuff. And that's what happened to me. That's how I really got fired up with it. So when I see some new stuff that really does that, I'll let you know. And if if there's interest from the people that listen to the podcast, I'll happily come and just show you.
Yeah.
This is what it could be.
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. So we'll stay tuned, and we'll definitely try and arrange a follow-up to check in and see how it's going. And of course, if you've got anything to show the listeners and the followers of this podcast, we can produce maybe a webinar or bring you back on to showcase your findings. And I think that's a fantastic idea. Thank you.
Cool. Pleasure.